I didn't raise my voice when the HOA president demanded to know why I was charging his neighbors $25 to drive through his community. I just pulled out the original 1947 county road survey and spread it across the hood of his BMW, pointing to the section that clearly marked the access road as a private easement across my family's ranch. The look on his face when he realized that every single house in Sunset Ridge Estates could only be reached by crossing my property was worth the 6 months I'd spent researching territorial land grants and easement law. His wife kept screaming about calling the police, but their lawyer was already on his phone, probably calculating how much this mistake was going to cost them. Before any of this started, I was just trying to live quietly on the land my great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1923. After 28 years working oil rigs across Texas and Oklahoma, I'd come back to the family ranch to take care of my aging father and maybe raise some cattle on the 240 acres we still owned. The property wasn't much to look at from the highway, rolling hills covered in mesquite and oak trees, with a modest frame house that had been added onto over the decades as the family grew and prospered. But it was home in the deepest sense of the word, the place where 4 generations of my family had worked the land, raised children, built something that would last. My daily routine was simple and satisfying in ways I hadn't experienced since I was a kid helping my grandfather fix fences. I'd wake up at sunrise, check on the dozen head of cattle we kept in the back pasture, and spend the morning maintaining equipment or repairing whatever the Texas weather had damaged overnight. Afternoons, I'd drive the property boundaries, looking for broken fences or checking the condition of the old access road that connected our ranch to the county highway. It was a dirt and gravel track that had been there since before I was born, winding through a natural gap in the hills that provided the easiest route between the main road and what used to be open rangeland to the north. That northern section had changed dramatically over the past decade. What used to be the Hendricks family farm had been sold to a developer who'd built an upscale subdivision called Sunset Ridge Estates, 43 houses on half-acre lots, with manicured lawns, decorative street lamps, and all the amenities that attracted city folks looking for a taste of country living without actually having to work the land. I didn't mind the development. Progress is progress, and the Hendricks family had needed the money after old Tom died. The new neighbors seemed decent enough, and their kids liked to wave when they saw me driving my truck along the access road that ran between their subdivision and the highway. That road had always been the natural route to reach the northern part of our property, and it was the only practical way for the new subdivision to connect to County Road 1247. The developers had paved it and installed proper drainage, turning what had been a rough ranch road into something that looked almost suburban. I appreciated the improvements, since it made my own trips to check fence lines much easier. I figured it was a fair trade for allowing access across our land. Nobody had ever asked permission formally, but it seemed like the neighborly thing to do. The trouble started on a Wednesday morning in October when I found a chain-link fence blocking the access road about 50 yards from where it entered our property. Not a gate or a cattle guard that I might have understood, but a solid 8-foot fence with razor wire across the top and a sign reading Private Property Sunset Ridge Estates residents only, no trespassing. There was a small pedestrian gate with an electronic keypad, but the main road was completely blocked to vehicle traffic. I sat in my truck for probably 10 minutes, trying to figure out what I was looking at and why anyone would fence off road that crossed my family's land. I walked around the fence line, following it as it cut across the access road and extended in both directions, along what the HOA apparently thought was their property boundary. The construction was professional, and expensive concrete footings, galvanized posts, and proper warning signs every 50 feet. This wasn't some temporary barrier or a mistake by a fencing crew. Someone had spent considerable money to deliberately block access to my northern pasture, and they'd done it without saying a word to me about it. When I got home, I called the number on one of the signs and reached the property management company that handled Sunset Ridge Estates. The woman who answered the phone was polite, but not particularly helpful. She explained that the HOA had installed security fencing along their community boundaries to protect property values and ensure resident safety. When I told her the fence was blocking access to my land, she suggested I contact the HOA board directly and gave me an email address for their president, a man named Richard Blackwood. My email to Mr. Blackwood was straightforward and polite. I explained that the new fence was preventing me from reaching the northern section of my ranch, and I asked when it would be possible to install a gate or modify the barrier to restore access. I included my phone number and offered to meet at their convenience to discuss the situation. His response, which came back 2 days later, was not what I expected. According to Mr. Blackwood, the access road was entirely within the Sunset Ridge. Estates, community boundaries, and my claims of ownership were mistaken. He attached a copy of their subdivision plat map and suggested I consult with a surveyor if I had questions about property lines. I spent that evening looking at their plat map compared to the deed and survey records I had for our ranch. Their map showed the access road as community property entirely within the subdivision boundaries, with no indication that it crossed any external private land. But our family's surveys going back to the 1940s clearly showed that same road, crossing ranch property for nearly half a mile before reaching what was now their subdivision. Either their map was wrong, or someone had made a very expensive mistake when the community was planned and developed. The next week, I sent Mr. Blackwood copies of our property surveys and deed records, along with a second request for access to my land. This time his response was immediate and much less polite. He informed me that the HOA had consulted with their legal counsel and they were confident that their property boundaries were correct. Any further claims of ownership over community property would be considered harassment of residents, and continued trespassing on their access road would result in criminal charges. He also mentioned that several residents had complained about my truck speeding through their neighborhood, and that all non-resident traffic was now prohibited for safety reasons. I read that email 3 times, getting a little more amazed. Each time by the sheer arrogance of it. Not only were they claiming ownership of land that had been in my family for nearly a century, but they were threatening to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property. The complaint about speeding was particularly rich, since the access road had a 25 miles per hour speed limit that I'd never exceeded, and I'd been driving it respectfully for years before their community existed. That's when I stopped trying to be diplomatic and started researching property law in earnest. I drove to the county courthouse and spent an entire day in the records office, pulling every document I could find related to land ownership in our area. The original territorial surveys, homestead grants, subdivision plat maps, and environmental impact studies. I also requested copies of all the permits and approvals that had been required for the Sunset Ridge development, including their road, access agreements, and utility easements. What I discovered was even more interesting than I'd expected. The access road that the HOA had claimed as community property was actually documented as a private easement across our ranch, granted to the original developer in 1998 for the specific purpose of providing road access to the new subdivision. The easement agreement, which I found buried in a stack of development permits, was very clear about the terms. The developer was granted permanent access across our property for the road, in exchange for maintaining the road surface and drainage systems at their expense. But the underlying land ownership remained with our family, and the easement could be revoked if the terms of the agreement were violated. The most important detail was in Section 7 of the easement agreement, which specified that the access rights were non-exclusive and could not interfere with the landowner's use of their property. By installing a fence that blocked my access to my own land, the HOA had materially breached the terms of the easement. According to Texas property law, a material breach of easement terms could result in immediate termination of access rights, reverting full control of the land to the original owner. I also discovered that the original developer had sold the subdivision to a management company in 2005, and that company had been purchased by another firm in 2012, which had then transferred the property to the current HOA in 2018. None of those transfers had included any mention of the easement agreement or the access rights across our ranch. It appeared that each successive owner had assumed they owned the access road outright, without checking the underlying property records or easement agreements. Most valuable piece of information came from the county's own road maintenance records. The access road was classified as a private road on private property, not a public thoroughfare or community asset. The county had no responsibility for maintaining or policing it, and the landowner had full authority to control access and charge fees for usage. As long as emergency services weren't blocked, I could legally treat the road like any other private driveway or ranch access route. Over the next month, I gathered additional documentation and consulted with a property attorney who specialized in easement disputes. The lawyer confirmed what I'd suspected: the HOA had made a serious legal error by assuming ownership of property they didn't control, and their installation of the fence constituted a material breach that terminated their access rights under the original easement agreement. He also explained that as the landowner, had several options for addressing the situation, ranging from demanding immediate removal of the fence to charging access fees for continued use of the road. The fee option was particularly interesting. Since the road was entirely on my property and the HOA had voided their easement rights, I could legally charge whatever I considered reasonable for access across my land. The attorney suggested that $25 per vehicle per day would be well within the range of what courts had upheld for private road access fees, especially given that the HOA had been using my property without permission for several months. I decided to give Mr. Blackwood one final opportunity to resolve the situation amicably. My certified letter explained the easement breach, included copies of all the relevant property records, and offered to restore their access rights in exchange for immediate removal of the fence and a formal written apology for the harassment I gave them 30 days to respond and warned that failure to remove the barrier would result in enforcement of my full property rights, including the right to charge access fees. Their response came from a law firm in Dallas and was exactly what I expected. They disputed my ownership claims, denied any wrongdoing, and threatened to file a restraining order if I continued to harass their client. The letter also included a counterclaim that I was attempting to extort money from the community and suggested that my frivolous legal theories would be easily dismissed by any competent court. They gave me 10 days to withdraw my demands or face legal action for harassment and attempted extortion. I spent those 10 days having a contractor install a professional gate system across the access road, positioned just inside my property line where the road entered ranch land. The gate was beautiful heavy steel construction with an electronic card reader, intercom system, and a large sign explaining that this was private property and that access fees were required for non-emergency vehicles. I also had him install a small booth structure with electricity and climate control, where I could sit comfortably while managing access to my property. On the morning that my ultimatum expired, I drove to the gate booth at 6:30 a.m. and opened for business. The first Sunset Ridge resident to arrive for his morning commute was a man in a Lexus who seemed confused by the gate. When he rolled down his window, I explained that the road was on private property and that access required a $25 daily fee payable by cash or card. He argued with me for several minutes, insisting that this was a public road and that I couldn't charge people to use it. I showed him the property survey and easement documents, explained that the HOA had voided their access rights by installing the fence. He offered to accept his payment or provide directions to the alternate route that would add about 12 miles to his commute. He paid the $25. Over the next 2 hours, I collected fees from 18 more vehicles, including Mr. Blackwood himself, who arrived in his BMW around 8:15, looking absolutely furious. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, threatened to have me arrested for extortion, and insisted that I was violating multiple laws by blocking access to a residential community. I let him rant for about 5 minutes, then calmly explained the legal basis for the access fees and offered to provide him with copies of all the relevant documents. When he refused to pay the fee, I offered to call the sheriff's office so he could file a complaint, but suggested he might want to consult with his attorney first. He called his lawyer right there at the gate. I could hear both sides of the conversation through his car window. The attorney was apparently asking some very pointed questions about property surveys and easement agreements, because Mr. Blackwood's tone changed significantly during the call. By the end of the conversation, he was asking what it would cost to resolve the situation, and whether the HOA could be held liable for legal fees. If they lost a court case, he paid the $25 and drove through the gate without another. Word, by the end of the first week, I'd collected over $2,800 in access fees and had established a routine that worked well for everyone involved. Most residents had purchased weekly passes that reduced their daily cost and eliminated the need to stop and pay each morning. A few had chosen to use the alternate route, which was their right. But the majority found it more convenient to pay the fee than add 24 miles to their daily commute. One kept detailed records of every transaction, issued proper receipts, and even provided customer service by keeping the gate booths stocked with coffee and local newspapers. The legal response came faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, the HOA had filed for a temporary restraining order to stop me from charging access fees and demanding that I remove the gate system. Their complaint claimed that I was illegally blocking access to a residential community, engaging in extortionate business practices, and creating a public safety hazard by interfering with emergency vehicle access. They also demanded monetary damages for the inconvenience caused to their residents and asked the court to declare the access road a public thoroughfare. My attorney was ready for them. Our response included every piece of documentation I'd gathered over the previous months, along with expert testimony from 2 different surveyors confirming that the entire access road was located on my family's property. We also provided copies of the original easement agreement and demonstrated how the HOA's installation of the fence had constituted a material breach that terminated their access rights. The filing included photographs of their fence blocking my access to my own land, copies of Mr. Blackwood's threatening emails, and records showing that I'd made repeated good faith attempts to resolve the situation before implementing the fee system. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in November, and I arrived at the courthouse to find both lawyers, 3 HOA board members, and about a dozen Sunset Ridge residents crowding the hallway outside the courtroom. Mr. Blackwood kept glaring at me like I'd personally insulted his mother. His neighbors whispered among themselves and occasionally shot dirty looks in my direction. I felt a little like the defendant in a lynch mob trial. But I knew we had the law and the facts on our side. The judge reviewed both sides' arguments and supporting documents before asking some very direct questions about property ownership and easement law. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that long-term usage had established a prescriptive easement, giving them permanent access rights. But he couldn't explain why they'd installed a fence that blocked the original landowner's access to his property. When the judge asked for documentation proving their ownership of the access road, the best they could provide was the subdivision plat map that showed the road as community property, without any reference to the underlying land ownership or easement agreements. My attorney presented our case methodically and without drama. Property surveys showing continuous family ownership since 1923. The original easement agreement granting limited access rights in exchange for road maintenance. Documentation of the HOA's material breach when they installed the fence. County records classifying the road as private property. Texas statutes governing landowner rights and access fees. Every piece of evidence was properly documented, legally relevant, and directly contradicted the HOA's claims. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. He dismissed the HOA's request for a restraining order, finding that I was acting within my legal rights as the property owner. He also ruled that the HOA had indeed breached the terms of their easement agreement and that their access rights had been properly terminated as a result. Most importantly, he confirmed that as the landowner, I had the legal authority to charge reasonable fees for access across my property, that $25 per vehicle per day was well within the acceptable range for such fees. But the judge went further than just dismissing their case. He also awarded me attorney's fees and court costs, finding that the HOA had filed a frivolous lawsuit without conducting proper research into the underlying property rights. He specifically criticized their failure to review the easement agreements and property records before making claims about road ownership, calling it a fundamental failure of due diligence that wasted the court's time and the defendant's resources. The aftermath was immediate and satisfying. Mr. Blackwood resigned from the HOA board the following week, citing personal reasons that everyone understood had to do with his leadership during the legal disaster. 2 other board members followed him out the door, and the remaining residents elected a new leadership team that was much more interested in practical problem solving than territorial disputes. The fence came down within a month, and I received a formal written apology from the new board president, acknowledging their mistakes and requesting a meeting to discuss long-term access arrangements. That meeting resulted in a new easement agreement that was much more favorable to both parties than the original 1998 document. The HOA agreed to pay me a monthly access fee of $500, which was considerably less expensive than the daily fees, but provided me with steady income for allowing them to use my property. They also agreed to maintain the road surface and drainage systems, install proper signage, acknowledging that it was a private road across private property, and provide me with unrestricted access to all parts of my land. In exchange, I granted them permanent access rights that couldn't be terminated as long as they met their obligations under the agreement. The new arrangement has worked beautifully for everyone involved. The HOA saves money compared to the daily access fees, and they have certainty about their long-term access to the community. I receive steady income that helps with ranch expenses. I've regained full access to my northern pasture, where I'm now running a small herd of cattle. The road is better maintained than it's ever been, and there's mutual respect between me and the residents instead of the hostility that characterized the previous relationship. Most importantly, the whole experience taught me something valuable about standing up for your rights and the importance of understanding what you actually own. For years, I'd allowed the HOA to use my property without compensation simply because it seemed like the neighborly thing to do. I'd assumed that their development agreements included proper easement arrangements, and I'd never bothered to research the legal status of the access road. It took their aggressive overreach to make me realize that being neighborly doesn't mean letting people walk all over your rights. These days, when I drive through the gate to check on my cattle, I often see Sunset Ridge residents working in their yards or walking their dogs along the community trails. Most of them wave and seem genuinely friendly. Now that we've established a proper legal relationship instead of operating on assumptions and goodwill, the new HOA board has been professional and respectful in all our dealings, and they've actually helped me identify some drainage problems that were affecting both my pasture and their community infrastructure. The access fee income has allowed me to make some improvements to the ranch that I'd been putting off for years. I've upgraded the cattle handling facilities, installed a better water system for the back pasture, even built a small guest cabin where my kids and grandchildren can stay when they visit. The land is more productive and better maintained than it's been since my grandfather's time. I've got the financial security to keep operating the ranch for as long as I'm able. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Mr. Blackwood and his board had simply called me before installing their fence, or if they'd been willing to work out a reasonable arrangement when I first contacted them about the access problem. They could have avoided the legal fees, the public embarrassment, and the ongoing monthly payments by simply treating me like a neighbor instead of an obstacle to be removed. Their arrogance and assumption that they could bully me into submission ended up costing them far more than a respectful conversation would have. But I'm grateful for how everything worked out. The conflict forced me to truly understand my property rights and the value of what my family had built over the generations. It also showed me that sometimes the best response to unreasonable people is not anger or escalation, but careful research and patient application of the law. The gate booth is still there, though I rarely need to use it now that we have the monthly arrangement. But it serves as a nice reminder that this is private property, owned and managed by someone who understands its history and value. Now, when I sit on my front porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over land that's been in my family for a century, I know that it's truly secure and that the next generation will inherit not just the property, but a clear understanding of what they own and how to protect it. The access road that caused so much trouble has become a source of steady income and a symbol of the importance of knowing your rights. And every month when I deposit that HOA check, I remember that the best revenge is often just making sure people pay fairly for what they want to use.